Well, hello and welcome to this webinar featuring the new book, Exiting Violence, the Role of Religion. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I had the pleasure of participating in one of the conferences that led to this new publication. It was a conference hosted by the Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento, Italy, a wonderful gathering. And so I'm very pleased to see this new book now in print. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three of my Georgetown colleagues who contributed chapters to this book. All three of them are fellows at the Berkley Center. And let me introduce each of them all too briefly now. Deborah Tonelli was a leader of the project and co-editor of this new volume, Exiting Violence. She's a permanent researcher at the Center for Religious Studies at Fondazione Bruno Kessler, FBK. She's also Georgetown University's representative in Rome, and she's a lecturer in religion and violence at Gregorian University. Leo Lefebvre is the Matteo Ricci Professor of Theology at Georgetown. He's written several books, including, I believe, most recently, Transforming Interreligious Relations, Catholic Responses to Religious Pluralism in the United States. He's also a priest in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Jocelyn Cesari has many affiliations, including holding the chair of Religion and Politics and director of research at the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham in England. She's a former president of the European Academy of Religion. Her latest book is We, God's People, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in the World of Nations. Deborah, Leo, Jocelyn, thank you so much for participating in this webinar today. Congratulations to all of you on the publication of this new book. For the format of today's webinar, I'm going to pose an initial question to each of the panelists to get them talking about their own scholarly contribution to this book. Then we'll have a bit of conversation among the panelists, and then around 12:30 or so Eastern time, we will open it up to Q&A with the audience, and we'll conclude at the 1 hour mark. If you have a question, you can type it at any time, clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do be brief in phrasing your question, and let us know to which panelist you are addressing your question. This webinar is being recorded, and a captioned video will be posted on the event page and on YouTube. And for those who registered for the event, you'll get an email with a link to that video as soon as it's ready. Well, let's dive right in. I want to start with Deborah as the co-editor of the volume. Deborah, tell us, before we get into your own scholarly contribution to the book, tell us a little bit about the institutional partnerships and the events that led to this publication.
Wow, thanks, Jude, and thanks to the Berkley Center for hosting this book launch. And to answer to your question, I have to distinguish three phases in which FBK, Reset Doc, and the Berkley Center played a decisive role. And the preliminary one, in which I identify the theme. The second, in which, together with Gerard Mannion, co-editor of the book, I developed the project and identified the research questions. And the third is that of the book. As regards of the first phase, the project began a few years ago when I was working on the divine images in Old Testament, in particular focusing on divine violence. And the FBK gave me the opportunity to organize some seminars to explore the social and political consequence of these images, that is the way they contribute to the creation of a social imaginary, understood as a background of shared meaning. I discussed this project with Giancarlo Bosetti, director of Reset, and with Gerard Mannion. At that time, Gerard was a Maturo Chair in Catholic Studies at Georgetown University and invited me to spend some months at the Berkley Center, where I was able to discuss the project in its early stages with extraordinary and experienced people. Gerard not only impacted the project with his ideas, but made it possible by sharing a network of contacts with leading scholars. And the stay at Georgetown was decisive in seeing, first of all, the complexity of the issues at stake, the dynamics between religion and violence, but also the layers of conflicts. The second step of this project was to hold two international conferences, the first at FBK, and the second at the Berkley Center, where we brought together scholars from all over the world. So FBK, Reset, Doc, and the Berkley Center provided tremendous support, making it possible for scholars from all over the world to participate, share contacts, and create the best atmosphere to discuss such sensitive topics. And during conferences, we discussed the role of sacred text, the role of religion in the geopolitical context, the role of religions to exit violence. And each of these institutions was critical to the success of the project. And the last phases after the conference was when Gerard and I realized that reflection needed to continue and asked some colleagues to rework their talks in light of the debate that had ensued during the conferences. We then started working on this book. And unfortunately, just at that time, Gerard suddenly passed away. Despite the shock and despite the difficulties, the partner institutions and the authors have always supported and encouraged me to complete this project. And the list of thanks is very, very long. When De Gruyter agreed to publish the book, I thought that Gerard would be proud of the result. Although the book came out 5 years after his passing, but it bears his imprint. Apart from some necessary updates, the structure of the book was the one we thought of together, and each chapter deals with the crucial issues. I am also deeply grateful to the publisher De Gruyter because its team did an extraordinary job on the manuscript. And the final work is divided in two main parts, the analytical historical approach and the philosophical and theological reflection. This because one cannot talk about the dynamics between religion and violence in a general way. Each situation has its own dynamics. But I think that we will have time in a second step to talk about this. Thank you, Jude.
Well, thank you. Thank you for setting the table for us for this discussion. And thanks also for your kind words about Gerard. You had a very nice section in your opening chapter about him and his role broadly and his role in this project and the book as well. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you about one of the chapters you contributed in which you distinguish between religion, theology, and faith, saying each of these three intersects with conflict in different ways. So the question for you would be, how do you understand these three different concepts or phenomena, religion, theology, and faith? And how did making that distinction help us better understand the role that religion plays in violent conflict?
Thank you for these questions, because I would say that this distinction is critical to understanding conflicts in which religion plays a role and their narratives. We hear often about religious conflicts, but in fact, this term, religion, remains very ambiguous. And the question we needed to ask is what is the intersection between religion and violence? And also, what do we mean by religion? The first form of knowledge is the ability to distinguish things. And here we must distinguish different aspects of a religion, that is theology, religion, and faith. And this distinction does not apply to all tradition, but that is also why it can help us better understand the dynamics between religion and violence. By theology, in this book, I mean the doctrinal tradition, the theoretical and meaningful basis of practice and beliefs. Theology is a set of doctrines on God, the origin of the world and the cosmos, their meaning. This does not mean, however, that believers are also theologians. By religion, I mean a set of behaviors and beliefs related to the sacred, which are able to unify all believers in a single community, sharing values and traditions. But this does not mean, however, that all practitioners are necessarily believers or theologians. Let's try to go outside a church and ask people who have attended the Mass some theological notions, or whether they habitually pray privately. So theology is a theoretical knowledge, while religion produces social effects and influences both the community of believers and the public space. Last but not least, by faith, I mean a personal spiritual experience. This does not mean, however, that a believer is necessarily also a theologian or a practitioner. So to conclude, the complexity and the dynamics of a conflict change depending on what is involved. That is theology, religion, or faith. If theology is evoked in conflict, there are chances that it is ideological. In the case of conflicts, political and economic reasons often require an ideology, and therefore they use theology as a narrative, which provides the horizon of meaning, non-negotiable principle, and a long-term visions. The literal interpretation of the sacred text, for example, can contribute to the creation of an ideology. This is because the sacred text is assumed as a self-evident datum, which does not need other device to be interpreted. Or, as Gerard explains in his text, a religious value becomes absolute, preventing conscience from making its own assessment. So if the conflict has to do with the social and political coexistence, it is a religious one and implies issues such as identity, social organization, political power, the idea of citizenship. Sometimes both theology and religion play different roles in different moments of the conflictual dynamics. And faith, remaining closed in the private sphere, can build an harmony among a different kind of spirituality without recourse to rational or social mediation. So the speculative critical theological dimension and the social practical religious dimension can play a role in peacemaking, but they need to engage in a negotiation of value, doctrines, practice, and so on. So for these reasons, I think that this distinction is very, very helpful to interpret religious conflict and more in general, the dynamics between religious and violence.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. That is very helpful. Maybe something we'll come back to in conversation. I want to bring in Leo now. Thanks for joining us, Leo. Often, at least those of us in the States or in Western Europe, when we think about something like religious violence, we're prone to think of it as something that happens somewhere else in the world or among Christians, something that is more a problem for non-Christian religions. But you show in your chapter that there's a long history of the use of religion, or more particularly, interpretation of the Bible to justify all kinds of violence in colonial America and throughout the history of the United States. Wonder if you could share a little bit more about the history and the argument that you present in your chapter.
Yeah, I do an overview of the conflicting interpretations of the Bible, sometimes justifying oppression and sometimes supporting movements for liberation. So when the Spaniards came to the Caribbean and southern parts of the United States, they're sent, in name at least, by Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. And one purpose is to spread the gospel. They often interpreted the activities of the indigenous peoples as idolatry and often condemned them. But in principle, they're supposed to take care of them. And they set up an encomienda system that in principle was supposed to be kind of a paternalistic benevolence, where the people to whom the indigenous people were commended, encomienda, they were supposed to be protected. In fact, it was tremendously oppressive. It wasn't legal slavery, but it was functionally slavery. And so one of the most important moments happened on the fourth Sunday of Advent in 1511 on the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, Santo Domingo, when a Dominican preacher, Antonio Montesino, shocked everybody by letting loose on the landholders who were abusing the indigenous peoples. And it's drawing upon the prophets of ancient Israel and the teaching of Jesus and just giving them hell, telling them that these are human beings, that they have no right to work them to death or to starve them, and really threatens them with eternal damnation. It shocked everybody. We're not sure if the young Bartolomé de las Casas was present or not, but it made a huge impression on him. And over time, he would become one of the most articulate spokespersons interpreting the Bible on behalf of the indigenous peoples against the oppressive practices of the Spanish Empire. And so this set up a dynamic that will go down through the centuries, and there's still elements in play today. Further north, the Puritans came to New England escaping the Stuart monarchy. So they saw the Stuart monarchy as having fallen into a form of corrupt Christianity and wanted to escape. They identified themselves with the biblical Israelites. They were on a mission, an errand in the wilderness, and they were called to set up a city on the hill, the image of Jesus, to be an example to the nations. But what this biblical imagery did was cast the inhabitants there in the position of the inhabitants of the promised land, the Canaanites. And so again and again in Puritan preaching, the indigenous peoples were referred to variously as Canaanites or Amalekites. And there was one very early conflict between the Pequot people in present-day Connecticut and the Puritans. And in one of the engagements, the Puritans just slaughtered the people inside the village in Mystic, Connecticut. And when they were challenged afterwards, because a lot of these were women and children fleeing the fire, they answered, "We had justification from the word of God." So on the one hand, Puritans think they're the Israelites. Then further south in Virginia, and eventually throughout the British colonies, there's slavery, which over the course of the 17th century becomes more and more racialized slavery. And there's a whole racist interpretation of the Bible that develops, often interpreting the so-called curse of Ham in the book of Genesis as if that somehow justified enslaving all people of African descent. And so this sets in motion another clash of interpretations where African Americans think we're not in the promised land. For those who become Christian, they hear the message of the Bible and especially the story of the Exodus as about them. And so this is not the promised land, this is Egypt. And they identify with the Israelites still in slavery. And so one of the most famous and moving hymns of the African Americans is "Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." So this shapes the whole consciousness of African Americans. Meanwhile, when some indigenous Americans become Christian, they begin reading the Bible themselves, and they're aware of this whole Puritan narrative that they're the Israelites. And they think this whole Exodus narrative is extremely problematic. One of the indigenous leaders even wrote a book, Reading the Bible with Canaanite Eyes. And so they identify with the indigenous peoples who are being oppressed, and they challenge the whole model of the Exodus being applied to North America. So throughout the whole painful history, you have some Christians who interpret the Bible as justifying their own oppressive practices, and then others, especially African Americans and Indian Americans, who find hope, a full affirmation of their own humanity, an affirmation of their own rights and their dignity before God, which then fuels a variety of liberation movements.
Thank you so much, Leo, for that overview. Much appreciated. I want to bring in my colleague Jocelyn Cesari to talk about her contribution to the book. Jocelyn, you begin your chapter by saying that Islam, more than any other religion, deals with the perception that it's inherently violent. And in your chapter, you deal with the history of the usage of the term ummah. And I'm wondering for you, how does an awareness of the different ways that term has been used, how does that help us better understand this relationship between Islam and violent conflict?
Thank you, Jude. Indeed, when we think about religion and violence in general, we think about Islam nowadays. And all my work has been about finding a response to the riddle that if you look in the past of Islamic history, actually Muslim empires were much more tolerant in terms of accepting diversity and plurality of faith, culture, languages than any of the Western kingdoms. So how do we go from this historical inclusiveness to the understanding of today that Islam is inherently violent? So the premise to that is that no religion as such is inherently violent. I know that we deal in our world of social sciences with attempt to show statistically that religious violence is worse, quote unquote, than secular violence, which is not grounded in any empirical reality, in fact. And if we look at secular ideologies, they have done more damage to people across centuries than religious violence has. So this is the background. And to understand the role of violence in Islam, it has to do with the fact that no religion is inherently good or bad. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So the job of scholars like us is not to take one side or the other, but to try to understand how and when violence emerge. So when we look at Islam and three concepts that I don't have the time here to get into detail, but the three are connected. It's Ummah, Jihad, and Sharia. And today they have taken a certain meaning carried by Muslims themselves. And Ummah is usually presented, including by religious authority, as a community of Muslim believers today across nations. Interestingly, if I go back to Muslim empires, Ummah was not the community of Muslim believers. Of course, it was there, but the Ummah initially is designed as revelation-based community given to the revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad through the mediation of the Archangel Gabriel, and Jews and Christians are part of this Ummah. When the Prophet Muhammad is in Medina, he creates a constitution that is a signal of the Ummah that's called the Medina Constitution. This is inappropriate. Constitution comes from modern time. It's more like a document acknowledging that there are Jewish and Christian tribes and everybody is part of the Ummah. When you move to the Muslim Empire, it's interesting that they kept this understanding that the Ummah, under the purview of the Caliph, is multi-religious, multi-linguistic, and multicultural. So if I were Greek Orthodox in Istanbul, I am part of the Ummah. So there is no understanding of a unified Muslim group across boundaries. Muslims are under the purview of the Caliph, but if I'm a Jew or a Christian, I am also part of the Ummah. This changed with the encounter with the West, and especially with the concept of nation, the nation having this specificity as a modern community to incite people to self-determination based on sovereignty of people and equality of membership. As I show in my work, these two features linked together do not exist in any religious community, including Christianity. Okay. So it's not that Christians, you know, I used to read sometimes like Christianity has some kind of inherent connection with, you know, separation of religion and politics. It is not historically accurate either. Every religious community has been challenged by the building of the nation because of these two principles. And so for Muslims, when they encounter the Western concept of nations through different, you know, interaction, again, that's not part of the discussion here, they're going to think of what is the way of competing with the West. And so they have two paths in front of them. One will be to adopt the national concept of nation, and that's why we have first colonial and then post-colonial nations. And you have at the same time Muslim intellectuals who say we have in Islam enough resources to build an alternative community. And that's why the Ummah becomes this entity of Muslims linked together by Islam rather than language or ethnicity. It's interesting at the time that the pushback of the ulama is to say, we don't want to be a nation. A nation is racist. Islam is a more encompassing and I think at the time more open and accepting framework than nation. So as we know, this didn't happen this way, but that's where the term Ummah as a community of Muslim believers take roots. And that's where people are still operating on it today. But it is a modern attempt to fight with nation. And so it becomes a political or public or political ideology. And that's a problem here, because Muslims now are operating on the idea that they have to defend, to protect the Ummah, not as much as a revelation-based community, like it was created at the time of the Prophet, but as a political entity that is under threat. And when you are in this mentality, and that has been true for any religious communities across time, you tend to rely on violence. And the violence is described here as resistance. And this again goes back to the colonial and then anti-colonial movement. That's where also the term jihad becomes resistance. Jihad was never resistance. And Sharia becomes state law, meaning you need the state to protect Islam. So these three elements together create a new understanding where then violence becomes justified to maintain this political community at all costs. And I want to insist here and close on that because I may already have gone over my time, that the transnational and national understanding of the political community here are not incompatible. Actually, even the nationalist leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt or Bourguiba, or even Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad today in Syria, they also rely on this global and more transnational approach of the political community playing on Arab and Islamic identity. So there was a lot of fluidity there that are still present, and that explain why for people like Baghdadi, when he built Daesh or the so-called caliphate, it was a modern understanding. We bring together all Muslims under a purview of one law for everybody, and everybody has to be a Muslim and to follow the same understanding of law, which is unthinkable at the time of the historical caliphate. So what I'm trying to say here is that the terms are there, but the meanings, there is a cluster of meanings, and some of the ones that are used in the political mobilizations come from a very modern challenge or turn of events. And they are not automatically justified or relying on theology, to go back to the distinction made by Deborah in the beginning. So I stop here.
Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Let me remind the audience, this is a good time to begin posing your questions to our panelists. Again, you click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I see one question already, which we'll get to. Would love to have some more in there. So take a minute to formulate a question for one or more of the panelists. Well, what Jocelyn just shared now, I think nicely segues to a general question that I wanted to pose to all three panelists, and that is this whole issue of whether religions or specific religions are inherently violent or inherently peaceful. At a popular level, there's still very much this perception that all religions or some religions are just inherently peaceful or inherently violent. And so scholars need to continually remind audiences that religion's role in world affairs is ambivalent. It can fuel violence, it can foster peace, it can be part of the problem, part of the solution. You see that echoed in this book. The question I have for all three of you is how did this project, how did this book add some greater depth and nuance to this basic insight of religion's ambivalence? All three of you have touched on this a little bit already, but would love to hear your thoughts on how to kind of be anchored in that assessment of ambivalence, but add depth and nuance to it. Deborah, why don't I go back to you, and would love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Thank you so much. This is a great question. So I'd like to answer starting by the distinction between theology, religion, and faith, that is a doctrine, practice, and spirituality, because each of three can play a positive or negative role in the public space and in conflict. Theology can become ideology. Religion can create communal or exclusivist spaces and practice. Faith is such a personal and intimate dimension that it impacts little in the communal space. Sacred text, to which the last word is often entrusted, can either prompt reflection or to be interpreted literally. But at the end, religion remains almost an abstract concept. What I mean is that the problem is not religion in itself or theology as ideology, but the human being who adheres to it. The question, the true question, the deep question is, what is the purpose of your faith? What criteria do you use to live your religion? And what narrative do you adhere to? All chapters of the book in different way, directly or otherwise, invite this reflection, proposing also different examples in the way in which we can live our religiosity. Concept may help us to understand, but the personal discernment help us to make the question our own and to take a responsibility for the choice. And this is very important when we need to have a critical approach to the political narrative, able to involve religions in different aspects, on different level of the conflict. So this is my answer.
Thanks, Deborah. Leo or Jocelyn, do you want to speak to this question as well?
Happy to say a few things on that. What is again, I'm talking from my own research and lens here, but what I have noticed is that the question of religion and violence has to be relocated in the communal dimension of religion, because if we look at it at the individual level, we are losing sight that sometimes religion as a community is defended by people who are not automatically the most religious, I would say, pillars of churches or mosques, you know. It is today invested with a political project. And here doesn't mean automatically you want to take the states, although the most violent expression of it, and you can go back to the Capitol attacks a few years back in the US, you can, again, I mentioned Daesh, the idea that you need to capture the state to fulfill the religious commitments of your community. This is something where you see the potential for violence, okay? And that's something we are not paying attention enough, because coming from the Western scholarship, we look at religion first and foremost as an individual feature. And if you look at the origin here, religare, religion means linking people together. It means we have lost sight of this communal dimension. And people are investing in it, like they invest in a political community that will define or protect what you think is the fate for you, but also for your group. And that is something here we especially in political science, which is my discipline, we still sternly look at religion as personal belief or doctrines, you know, like a sort of nice cognitive entity that has its own rational. And we forget that for people, sometimes when they become violent, it's about defending a community. And that's what I have learned from my study of Islam, but I can see it emerging everywhere in all other religions. And that's why I appreciated the presentation of our friend and colleague Leo here, because we tend to forget that in the US we have also this dimension of communal violence, you know.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Leo, thoughts on this topic before we go to our Q&A? And I'm seeing there's now several questions, so I'm glad to see that. We'll turn to those in just a moment.
When Spanish Franciscan missionaries arrived in the southwest of what is today the United States, they had to make decisions on what was, quote, religious or not. So the indigenous people were farming, they're plowing. That's not religious, so you can still keep farming. Dancing, they decided dancing is religious, so you can't dance. Sacred dances were illegal into the 20th century under United States law. To the indigenous peoples, this made no sense whatsoever. They had no concept of religion, no sense that this is this and this is that. And so many scholars working on North American history problematize any definition of religion, pointing out that however you want to draw the box around religion is somewhat contingent and even arbitrary. And so the one scholar, Severin Fowles, who studied the archaeology of the Pueblo nation, proposes the term doings. And so he wrote a book, The Archaeology of Doings, but he had to put in the subtitle, A Study of Pueblo Religion, so people would know what it was about. And so to ask, is religion inherently violent, is a problematic question, because there is no inherent essence of religion that is kind of supratemporal. In different places, different times, people view things as religious or not, and it's always perspectival. In terms of the texts, I like the appeal of the late chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, Lord Jonathan Sacks. He closed his book, The Dignity of Difference, noting in the Bible and in other religious texts, we have passages that are more abrasive and passages that are more on the side of hospitality and generosity. We choose, as interpreters, which texts we use to interpret the others. And so you can find passages in the Bible, like in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself, that you can then say goes right into the golden rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated. On the other hand, you have the conquest narratives. In the book of Deuteronomy, the Israelites are commanded to kill all the inhabitants of the land because they're idolaters. We choose how we interpret these. And so to say it's inherently one thing or the other is, I think, something of an arbitrary question.
Thank you, Leo. Much appreciated. Well, we got several good questions, so let's dig right into them if we can. One topic I thought might come up is Russia and Ukraine, and sure enough, it's the very first question. It's also the one that's addressed, albeit briefly, in the foreword by Jose Casanova, another Georgetown colleague, the foreword to the book. But let me read the question from Pedro Constantino. He asks, in your opinion, what is the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and especially the Patriarch of Moscow in the escalation of the conflict and a holy war by Russia against Ukraine? Hot contemporary topic. Anyone want to address that? Perhaps how that conflict further elucidates the things we've been talking about here.
I would like to say a few words because in my last book, I have this whole chapter on Russia and Orthodoxy, and the book was published before the war in Ukraine. And from the work I was doing, it was clear to me that the vision of the Russian nation include a global understanding of Orthodoxy, and Ukraine has always been presented as part of this natural Orthodox community. So it was quite interesting for me when the war started that the whole argument was that it's because Ukraine asked to apply to NATO. No, there was an ongoing understanding from Russian domestic politics that we cannot allow Ukraine to take a separate route. And the Patriarch was absolutely in line with that. So here you see the understanding of national interest echoed by the global understanding of Orthodoxy that is Russian, Slavic, and that is a good example again of national and global or international approach right there. So there is no surprise. It was not surprising. It was just a matter on how and when. And unfortunately, we know what happened since then.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Let me go to another question just so we get as many of these in as we can. This one might be a good one, particularly for Leo, but others feel free to jump in as well. The most recent question to come in is, what is the dimension of ecumenism in peace today? I guess the role of ecumenical and interfaith efforts in promoting peace. Leo, you've written books on this, been a part of particularly of Christian Buddhist dialogues. Would you like to address that question?
Sure. There were early efforts of different Christian ecumenical leaders and also Jewish leaders to come together during the First World War and after in the United States for the relief of the suffering of people involved in the war. And during the war, Pope Benedict XV proposed a program for peace, and he gave away most of the assets of the Holy See and his own family assets for humanitarian relief. And even though the peace program wasn't accepted, this was noticed. After the war was over, the last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire contributed money to set up a statue in honor of Pope Benedict XV in Istanbul. It's in front of the Catholic Church of the Holy Spirit there today. And it bears the inscription to the great Pope, benefactor of humanity in the world's tragic hour. And it notes that he gave generously to people no matter what their religious background. So precisely in this time of tremendous tragedy, there was a coming together around humanitarian assistance. And this has been a thread going throughout more recent decades. There's a lot of different peace movements where people have come together. In the Parliament of the World's Religions that met in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999, Nelson Mandela spoke about the encouragement of religious leaders from a variety of different traditions for the people struggling against the system of apartheid. And he suggested the system, the protests went more peacefully precisely because of the interreligious support. Otherwise, then it could have gone more violently.
Thanks, Leo. Well, you mentioned, Jocelyn, you're unmuted. Do you want to share a response to that question as well?
No. Sorry, I should have muted myself. No,
okay.
no.
Well, Leo just mentioned South Africa, so we've got a question coming from Cape Town from Giovanni Lucetti. He asks, just as ordinary language struggles to express the ineffable, religious expression faces similar limitations. This is evident in religious texts and public discourse, where religious language can clarify or obscure deeper truths. How can these limitations align with religion's role in promoting peace and resolving conflict? So a big and complex question. about the difficulty of expressing truths that we have in religious communities. Anyone, Deborah, do you want to address that one?
Yes, dude. My answer is very simple, very fast. Through education. That is teaching the sacred text, inviting us to reflect, questions us, and offer non-answer. The role of the sacred text is not to collect a set of moral values, but to tell stories and testimony of the experience of God. And in the sacred text, we find everything and its contrary. So it means that the meaning of the sacred text is not included in only one message, but in our ability to question it and to live it questions us. This is very important, to maintain a critical approach and not waiting for answer from the sacred text. And in this, the pastoral in each church, the pastoral plays a very, very important role.
Thank you, Deborah. I want to pose a question that comes from Stephen Shore, and it's one that we could have spent the entire hour, could spend an entire semester and more on sort of the definitions of religion. What are we actually talking about here? But I thought this one might be quite interesting to grapple with. Deborah, in your chapter and in your remarks, you started with this kind of Durkheimian definition of religion as a community that built around sacred beliefs. And Leo, you brought our attention to the fact that the conceptions and understandings and experiences of what we might call religion vary vastly from place to place. Some places it's very differentiated, other places it's totally undifferentiated from the rest of life. But the subtitle of the book is The Role of Religion. So what exactly are we talking about here? Stephen Shore asks, do you consider fascism and communism to be religions, or must religion involve explicit faith in a divine power? Who'd like to tackle that big question? Jocelyn.
Yeah, because that is a very interesting question. I think the term here about any totalitarian regime or even any secular ideology with a collective power is about sacred. And sacred is not only religious, it can go with very secular project. The nation is sacred. When people die for a flag or die for their country, this is exactly the definition of sacredness. So indeed, fascism and the communism are sacred understanding of the group, meaning if you do not behave in the right way and respect the symbol of this particular ideology, you pay the price for it. That is exactly what sacred is. And indeed, I would not get into any definition of what is religion. Everybody has given up on giving a definition. But I want to insist that sacred and religious are not the same. You have a sacred dimension of politics. And that's where, for me, the sacredness of the religious community and the sacredness of political project can either go together or clash with each other. And that's where violence emerges.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Deborah, there's a question directly for you. And given your location there in Rome, a good question for you. Annie Selleck asks, Deborah, I'm curious how you see this work, the project in the book, I presume, interacting with the church's synod on synodality, if at all. For example, does the way of being church versus religion or faith and listening challenge underscore or share any insights from this work? Want to unmute, Deborah?
Sorry, I was unmuted. Sorry. My impression is that this synod was very, very important. I spoke with some colleagues who participate in the meetings of this synod, and they told me that they really felt, they really had the experience of the prophecy of the church. This means not to receive the final message from top to down, but to be really involved in a dialogue with this church. And Pope Francis is really working to change the church and to free the church for each secular limits. The church that we are living now is a revolutionary church. And of course, it's facing several obstacles because it's very, very difficult to change our mind. But through the synod, the attempt of Pope Francis is to make the whole church, all Christians, responsible and a participant of the church itself. And it's very, very important because it means that the cardinal, the bishops have to listen the voice of the common people and to include their requests, their questions in their reflection. And this is a new action of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Deborah. Let's see. Both Jocelyn and Leo talked about colonial experience. There's a question here that deals with that from Gloria Moran. What role does post-colonial resentment play in fueling religious violence?
It can play a major role. Colonialism generally involved violence, sometimes greater, sometimes lesser, but it was an imposition on people. And there was both the physical domination, but also the humiliation of the people. That often in the white European colonial empires, there was a disdain for people of color. So there were multiple levels that could give rise to resentment. The danger of resentment is it can be unending. So it can always feed on grievances. And so what can begin as a just struggle against an oppressive regime, I think has a risk to perpetuate itself in ways that are unhealthy. This is where I think one of the most important conversations interreligiously was the visit of Howard Thurman to Mahatma Gandhi in India in 1936. Howard Thurman was one of the leading African Americans. And the two of them had this very profound conversation. Gandhi was interpreting the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount as something that could be used practically for social transformation of a society on a level no Christian had ever really done before. And the African Americans were very interested in this. And on both sides, there would have been plenty of material for resentment. But Howard Thurman was a really deep religious thinker. He's been called a mystic. And he resonated with the satyagraha of Gandhi. And reportedly, as the African American delegation was leaving, Gandhi made kind of a hopeful prediction that it may be African Americans who will realize the hopes of grasping truth, satyagraha, nonviolent resistance to evil without resentment, more effectively than anywhere else. And that inspired then later generations of African American leaders to apply principles of Gandhi to a very different context in the United States. And that's one way to avoid the danger of resentment.
Thank you, Leo. Jocelyn, I wonder if you wanted to speak to that question about post-colonial resentment. And then we just have a few minutes left. I wonder if I could turn to you, Deborah, for a final word on where we go from here, either in terms of the project on religion and violence or where the broader scholarly community needs to go to continue to unpack these issues. But Jocelyn, over to you now.
Yeah, I would like to say a few words. It's more than post-colonial. I think it goes with oppression, domination, extortion of, assets of different countries or localities across the world. But what I have witnessed is it's not only material and physical. It's also that people were concerned and remain very concerned by the survival of their existence, of their ontological existence. In other words, what colonialism brings is an existential threat. And from this perspective, even if there is now independent countries across most of the planet, it's still very much, you don't need to have an official colonial power. And that's why symbolic violence is as important as military presence or material exhaustion. It is about, I feel threatened in what makes me or my group specific. And so it's beyond post-colonial. And we have really to address that, because when people feel threatened in this existential aspect, then violence becomes a solution for everybody. And again, it doesn't concern one religion in particular. It's about the condition of people and how religion can fuel or help overcome this existential threat. And I stop here.
Thank you, Jocelyn. All right, Deborah, I want to give you the last word. Thank you for getting us to this point, leading this project, co-editing this wonderful volume. Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Jude, Leo, and Jocelyn. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the Berkley Center for being here. I think that the book tells more that what we were able to tell this evening all together. So what I would like to do now is to continue to explore this topic on the dynamics between religion and violence, in particular working on the way in which mental images of God can impact and influence our religious imaginaries, and in this way to understand what's happening in the political propaganda, in the social square, and in general in the human relationships through religions and its imaginary. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Deborah. And I want to just echo your thanks to the panel for giving of your time and insights today. Thank you to my Berkley Center colleagues for arranging today's event. Thanks to all of our participants, especially those who posed some really, really good questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we were able to get to several of them, and that made for a very rich and stimulating conversation. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you on future Berkley Center events. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.